Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so in question number 11, I'm asked to find the domain of this function. This involves a radical. X plus 3 is underneath the radical, and we see that the index is an implied 2. It's a square root problem. Now, what we just talked about in the last video, anytime the index is an even number, we have a problem. If the index is an even number, whatever is under here cannot become negative. If it becomes negative, if this quantity under here becomes a negative number, we're going to not get a real answer, but we're going to get something with the letter I in it. And that's not what we want for functions. So here's how we prevent it. Whenever you're trying to find the domain of a function whose index is even, so in this case it's even, what we do is we set up an inequality. My pen's dying, so let me get a better one here. We set up an inequality that will allow us to get the kind of answers we want. And what we do is we take the quantity that's under the radical, which is x plus 3, and we force it to not become negative. Well, what does that mean? If you don't want something to be less than 0, right, that's a negative number. If you don't want it to be less than 0, you force it to be greater than or equal to 0. So the way you get the domain to these kind of problems when it's a square root function is you set up an inequality. You don't worry about the radical anymore. You only worry about what's under it. To find the domain, you're focusing on x. You set up an inequality. You take what's under the radical and you make it be greater than or equal to 0. When you solve this by subtracting 3 from both sides, x is any real number greater than or equal to negative 3. Now we were asked to write our answer in interval notation. This is the domain, this is the correct answer, but it's just not written the correct way. So, if I drew a number line, I found the number negative 3 greater than or equal to negative 3 would mean you put a bracket and you shade forever to the right, which means, all the way out to infinity and beyond, beyond that direction, that never going to stop. The way I would write this answer in interval notation is bracket negative 3 comma infinity paren, and that is my answer. So that is the domain of this function. And if you really wanted to test it out, if you pick any number in here, any number that's greater than or equal to negative 3, and you plug it in here, you'll come out with an answer. It's something you'll be able to take the square root of, and you'll never get I. So these are the correct numbers to use. That's why they're called the domain. Now, problem number 12 is identical to what we just did. What's the index? This is what you should ask yourself. If I'm trying to find the domain of this function, what's the index? It's 2. The most important thing that you should say is, okay, it's an even number. Whenever the radical function has an even index and you want to find the domain, the way you find the domain is you take the quantity that's under the radical, 3x plus 2, and you force it to be greater than or equal to 0. So you take whatever's under the radical, not the radical sign itself, but what's under it, and you force it to be greater than or equal to 0, and you solve this inequality. My first step will be to subtract 2. So I have 3x is greater than or equal to negative 2. And my final step would be to divide by 3. Now the reason I do not flip the inequality sign is because I divided by a positive 3. But remember your basic rules. If you had divided by a negative number, the inequality sign would have changed. Now that is actually my answer. That is the domain. I can use any x value greater than or equal to negative 2/3. But this problem asks for the domain in interval notation, so I suggest drawing a picture. Okay, x is greater than or equal to negative 2/3, so let's find negative 2/3 on the number line. Greater than or equal to, I put a bracket because the equals is there, and greater than, I shade in this direction. Of course, this direction means I'm heading toward infinity. And the way I write that answer in interval notation is negative 2/3 with a bracket because I'm including negative 2/3, comma, infinity with a paren. And that is my domain of this function. So again, remember, even index, set up an inequality, take the quantity under the radical with no radical sign, make it greater than or equal to 0, solve the inequality, draw your number line, come up with interval notation as your domain. Same here. Take the quantity under the radical, force it to be greater than or equal to 0, solve the inequality for x, draw a picture, and from that picture get your interval notation. Here's the domain of the function, here's the domain of this function, and we're done.